I mean, this is, I think, really one of the most amazing parts of the musical, not just musically, but because this entire song is massive unpacked one line of scripture where Jesus commands that God take the cup of suffering away from him. And I think it's just lyrically and musically, it's just this amazing soliloquy. But there's some really complicated things happening where Jesus is basically doubting his mission once again and wondering why he has to die so horribly to fulfill the will of God. The more I listen to these songs over and over again, I really think this entire musical is really about demanding an answer from God about things. We see that in Judas's last song, Superstar, and we also see it in here where not so much asking questions, but demanding an answer for God. Why are things this way? Why is your plan this instead of this, etc.? Really demanding answers from God, and in some cases refusing to accept the answer perhaps, or maybe not listening close enough to what God is saying. So we saw it in Judas's in several songs by Judas, and now we see it also in this song Gethsemane.
Yeah, it's interesting. Throughout the show, there's just like gentle hints to why. We've talked about a few of those. But the interesting thing about this show is that they've actually removed a lot of the reasons why, at least in their obvious ways. They might present evil and violence, but they never talk about sin. They just barely talk about resurrection. They don't talk about forgiveness of sins. They sort of approach love and the power of love, but they don't really say, why is God's true love and acceptance really powerful. They sort of hint towards it, but it's not quite mentioned. They remove other things like adoption, ascension, the establishing of God's kingdom, showing us the reality of our sins, restoration of relationship. The Trinity isn't there. A lot of these reasons why the cross is so pertinent and so important, they just remove, which it makes way for Jesus to actually have this conversation with God. Because otherwise he knows. Jesus throughout the scriptures continuously is saying, this is important. This is what I came here for. This is what I need to do. And here's all of the reasons. The other the rest of the 3 years was an exploration of that in a lot of ways. But they purposely removed it just to keep this struggle. But the thing is I think the struggle is real too. The words might not be the same, the doubt, I still think he could question even if he knew, but I think Jesus really struggled. It mentions that he sweat blood, that he struggled so much with this choice to follow God's will that he sweat blood. It's a real thing that can happen with immense, immense stress. And Jesus went through that. So I have little doubt he went through something like this. And sometimes we don't like hearing that Jesus struggled. But often we think struggle means weakness. But I don't think it needs to. Jesus became human. He struggled like we do. But he overcame it. Which is a big message for all of us too. We struggle. Doesn't mean we're weak. But do we overcome it? Do we follow God's will or our own?
Well, I can't remember who exactly said this, but the core idea is that God does not demand perfection from us, just devotion. It's not something that, and if we see perhaps the case of Jesus, with Jesus struggling, we definitely have a prime example of that. That he doesn't necessarily expect us to not make mistakes, but even while through the mistakes and the sin and all these things, he's demanding of us devotion and not, perfection, because it's not really capable of us anyways.
There's a few things also lacking from this that I think would have also been present. Just to keep in mind would be that this seems to be a very one-sided conversation. Sometimes we feel that way in our relationship with God, but there's very evident things that happens throughout Scripture. One of the Gospels mentions that angels come to him. There's continuously God actually speaking to Jesus in the Bible. There's what else is there? There's the confidence that Jesus actually has the words of God that he's presenting to them. And even this confidence is portrayed in this moment. They choose one gospel, which he says to God, if you can do this, if you can take this cup away from me. The rest of the gospels are a lot more sure about it. They say, all things are possible to you, God. If it is your will, you can. And then not my will, but your will be done. And so there is a confidence that Jesus has. And just because he's confident in God, just because he trusts, doesn't mean the struggle disappears. This is an amazing film. And it's an amazing story. And these are some amazing actors, really. The singing, the performing,
Well, Ted Neely plays Jesus in the 1973 one. He's basically made his life playing this role, and I think he's almost 80 now, and he just retired from this role in 2016. So it really became his life for sure. And one thing I also noticed about the 1973 one, it was actually filmed in Israel. So they were filming this whole movie in 40-degree heat or something, which is absolutely crazy.
We have some other things we could talk about if you want, but maybe we should see if anyone has any questions. Is that probably okay? Does anyone have any questions or anything that, especially for those that have watched it before, that questions that you have about it that you might want to ask?
Curious to know whether God still came before Jesus Christ.
Oh,
What it first.
that's a great question.
Oh.
Good old Google.
Well, I believe
Was Godspell after or before Jesus Christ Superstar? They kind of come around the same time. It's after.
1 year after. Actually, it's kind of interesting to mention around this time period. So this would be
74 or 70?
71 was Godspell. This was 70.
The film came out in 73.
Yes.
So that's
the film.
interesting.
Yeah. Around this time period, late 60s, late 70s, there was actually this massive presence of religious films and religious books, etc. For some reason, everybody was really perhaps analyzing or deconstructing Christianity. And I think this also comes aligned too with the counterculture arriving as well. Really sort of deconstructing a lot of things, and also in various religious in Catholicism there was the Vatican II, which basically revolutionized most of the liturgy and the way that the church was approached. And I believe that also influenced Anglicanism as well. There was kind of a big sweep in Anglicanism. So this musical really was in a fertile place where a lot of things were happening with religion, a lot of things were changing, whether for better or for worse. There's a lot of different commentary on that, but so this musical really is not really kind of a singular thing. It was really kind of part of this continuous deconstruction, I would say, of Christianity, which is quite interesting to read about. But the Godspell is a good example. Also, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat was just a few years before this. So there was really a lot of things like this happening.
It came out after the stage production, but before this film, I think.
Which
Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, because this was Andrew Lloyd Webber's first musical, I believe.
no, Joseph was before this.
Oh,
The
really?
one right before this.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
I have to do that, but
I think the music is really excellent, and it's constantly evocative and musically interesting. The orchestration is pretty good. I think the most interesting thing about what Weber has done is that he uses motives and themes over and over again. So everything is kind of interconnected and interwoven with each other. Some characters kind of have themes to themselves. Judas has kind of that the guitar riff, which first appears in the first song, but also reappears when Jesus is being whipped. So there's kind of interesting parallels that form, and everything is catchy, which I think is really great too, especially with musicals. I can hum every tune in this musical basically, so that definitely helps, I think. Yeah, and I really think this is Andrew Lloyd Webber's best work. Kind of sad because it was at the beginning of his career, but I think that together, Tim Rice and Weber, they worked really well together. They also did Evita and a few other ones that are not so popular, but I imagine also are quite quality. But musically, yeah, I think it's just really excellent.
they actually struggled a bit because Andrew Lloyd Webber wanted to really honor Jesus, and then Tim Rice wanted to sort of follow the cultural sort of challenging it. So you sort of see this as the combining of both sides trying to meet in the middle, I think, which is a really cool, I think, way of approaching it.
Yeah, and Weber actually did not want to write this musical. He thought it was a stupid idea, which is really funny because it's now become so amazingly popular and controversial.
He actually says that the worst day of his life was the opening of. It's very interesting. Not about the show, but about the production. Not only because of how people responded, but I think of how they actually staged it too. Like we said, how you stage it changes our understanding of the characters and everything so much.
Yeah, and also it's unfortunate that we don't have enough time to cover more characters, but another interesting character is Pilate.
Oh yeah,
I think. If you have time to watch the whole thing, the entire 2000 version is free on YouTube, so you can watch it there. But we could probably spend another 20 minutes just on Pilate, who is really sort of a small character, but in the musical he's his character is enriched so much. He's almost trying to defy the will of God by trying to save Jesus. So really with Pilate as well.
Can I just make a comment, guys?
Sure.
Yes, please.
Hey, it's Anne Marie. So
Hi, Marie.
I just want to say 1973, 74, 75, I would have been like 11, 12, 13. And we all had to sing I Don't Know How to Love Him in choir. And in our triple trio, our a cappella triple trio grade 7 band group that we had. I think it's genius that Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice put out this 2-disc album, this rock opera album, before they made it as a stage play. So any teenager in their right mind who bought the album had the songs memorized. By the time it came to the stage, by the time it came to the theater, they were singing it in their seats. You were listening to it in your car radio, like it was everywhere. And for some of the older folks who are watching this, you remember that. If your teenagers were all about this, you either love it or it was sacrilege. You either boycotted it and picketed, and like you guys said, Andrew Lloyd Webber thought it was the worst thing ever. Billy Graham hated it. So many people saw it as taking apart our belief system and our church. And yet the Vatican said, you know what? This is going to cause people to pick up their Bibles young people to pick it up and read about it and ask questions and come back to church, then it's got to be for the good. And that's just my comment. Like and oh my gosh, so just reading here online, the guy who was meant to play Herod, who got turned down in the end, he ended up writing Rocky Horror Picture Show. And if that's my movie, folks, it is from grade 9, grade 10. And you'd go to these movie theaters and you'd all sing the words and everybody had the album. And watching that 2001 version, that reminded me of watching Rocky Horror Picture Show. It was crazy, right? But I gotta say, cinematography, the way they portrayed it in Israel, the lighting, the staging, it's the costuming. That's like watching, the $6 Million Man or the Bionic Woman back in 1970s. That's what we dressed in. That's what we wore. You guys weren't even born yet. but I mean, yeah, it is.
Well, I should say that I do remember the 2000s. That's
Okay. Sorry.
Yes, that was the clothes and everything is straight from the 2000s.
Yeah.
Somebody read. I remember reading a YouTube comment on Simon the Zealot. We saw him only briefly, but somebody mentioned that Simon the Zealot was the most 2000s man who ever existed. He's like wearing a tank top and he has like frosted hip tips and a little.
It's interesting. Like, it actually took the Vatican a while to actually say that they approved of this film.
Right.
We've discussed it here together as a community, and I think that means something, and we can get a lot out of it. One of the difficulties is that story is so impactful. Jesus tells a lot of stories, and those stories live in us still. The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, those stories live in us in a different way. And so this story has a way of living in people. It's telling. I didn't actually know this was from Judas's perspective. And so I've known this musical for a long time, and not knowing it was from Judas's perspective lived in me in a different way, right? It did make me question certain things. And especially as a kid, I didn't always have the answers or the direction or always the community to really guide me. And so there is a challenge with how we tell stories. Indigenous people believe stories shape us. And so there always is a question of what are the stories we're telling? And how are they shaping us? And how are we actually understanding them?
And with a musical like this, I think that's very important to do, because overall, if you ask my opinion about this, I think this musical is really casting doubt on the Christian narrative. I think that's sort of, I'm pretty sure that's what Tim Rice was attempting to do with this. Not maliciously, but he was maybe projecting his own disbelief into a story about Jesus. But for many reasons that we talked about, how there's no miracles and there's no, et cetera, I think it all kind of forms together this story really about doubt and the emotional maybe struggles that come with this. So with this, talking about this musical, I think is very important from a Christian perspective, but it's not something that we should just kind of ingest and not think about critically.
But like all things, God shines through if we're looking for him. And that's one of the messages here too. He asks continuously, but God is there if they're willing to see it.
And you're always affected by something unexpectedly, even if it's not something directly related to faith or something. But I know whenever I watched the 1973 one, the Gethsemane scene, and Jesus says, "Just watch me die, see how I die." And there's all these religious paintings that pop up of Jesus being crucified, and really horrific paintings. There's one especially, I can't remember the painter, but it's Jesus dead on the cross, and his skin is turning blue. He's dead, and that it's just so horrible to look at, but that's what happened, right? And so every time I see that, I get emotional. I've watched this, 20 times now, and it still happens every time with the Gethsemane, the 1973.
Well, should we end it with prayer? Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
God, we have just finished a night of analysis and searching and probing and looking at a work that talked about your son Jesus, and even through this work, we see that it enriches our faith, and we thank you that we have music and we have art to point us to you in different ways. We thank you that you guided this conversation and that you guided our words. And I'd like to ask that you be with everyone here as they head home and help us to strengthen our faith, enrich it in new ways. Pray all these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone.